Okay, so we've got our gems able to be moved around, but of course at the moment they're not recognizing what they're doing. They're just moving into different positions, but we need them to actually start trying to find if they're adjacent to other gems and if they have a match so that we can destroy them or do whatever we want to do with them in the game. So let's stop this running here. I'm going to create a new object here that I'm going to call match finder, and we're going to add a new script to this object. So a new C# script. Again, we're going to call this match finder. And this is what we're going to use to find any matches on the board. So let's pop this in. We're just making this its own object just to, so we know that this is a separate thing that's running as its own little system. So first thing we're going to do in here is our match finder. It doesn't need a update function at all. And it doesn't need a start function either. So what we're going to do is create a private board reference called board, because we need to know the board so that we can access it to be able to check all our gems. And then we want this match finder to automatically find the board itself and then store it as a variable. So we're going to use the awake function for this. So awake in here, and in here we're going to say board is equal to find object of type board. Okay, so why are we using awake and why aren't we just using start? So if we go back to our board here, we know in the start function it set up the all gems and then it set up the it called the setup function, and that was perfectly fine. But we're using awake over here. So basically in Unity there's a certain order that things happen on every frame of your game, and we know the start function happens at the start when an object is first called in, and we know that update happens every single time. But basically in the order of things in Unity there's actually something extra, which is awake, and awake gets called, so a start excuse me, start gets called anytime an object first appears in the world, but awake gets called anytime an object is activated. So basically you have a match finder. If I had that deactivated and then activated, it would call the awake function every time. So every time you deactivate it and reactivate it, awake gets called. But what's really handy is awake actually gets called before the start function gets called. And that's why using awake is really good for doing things like finding different objects. So this way we're able to find the board, and then we know we have the board, and if we want to do anything at all, we know that, say if we had something in the start function of the board here, we say, okay, as soon as we start the game, maybe we want to set up all our gems and then immediately find any matches. Maybe that's how you might want to do that, to instantly make a whole bunch of gems disappear. Now, as we go a little bit further, we're actually going to make the gems never generate a match by default. But say in here you wanted to say, hey, go to the match finder and find all our matches. And it would do that. And if we put this in the start function, say we're going to have a function here to find matches, the board would go over here to find all the matches, and then this is going to start searching for matches on the board over here. But if both of these happen in the start function, with Unity you don't know which start is going to be called first. So we've got our start over here on the board, but there's nothing to say that, hey, this start could be called, but then this one could be not called, and it would go, hey, well, I haven't found the board yet. So if this one doesn't get called, it would go, okay, I'm going to try and access the board, but I haven't found it. So it would start throwing up errors all over the place. So that's why we use the awake function to assign variables that we need to find that this script is going to use over and over again. So just a quick brief overview there on why we use the awake function. But with that all in mind, basically all you need to know is, hey, we find the board at the very start, and then we're going to say, we're going to use a public void called find all matches. And what this is going to do is it's going to loop through our board, and basically we're going to check each gem that we have, and we're going to check and see, hey, I'm going to check horizontally and I'm going to check vertically, and I'm going to see, is there one to the left and one to the right of me for every single gem on our board. So what we're going to do is we're going to, much like we did when we were generating the board over here, where we created the X and Y for loops, we're going to do the same thing again, but I'm going to just copy that this time just to make it easier, just to save us typing it out every time. So we're going to put that in there, and then we need to put some close brackets. So we had 2 open, so we need to make sure we add in 2 close brackets. And of course it doesn't know what the width and height are because they're on the board, but that's why we have a reference to the board here. So here we're going to say board.width and board.height. Okay, so now that we have that, first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the gem that we're currently looking at, so the gem at the position we're looking at specifically, is not missing. For some reason, let's say we get to the point, let's just play the game here. We get to the point where we make these 3 match and disappear. So we want to make sure when we're doing our check that that there isn't an empty one here, because if there's an empty one here, then obviously we can't find a match for it. So we're just going to say, hey, we're going to ignore it if there's an empty one in that slot. So let's go back in here. We're going to say if, well, first we're going to say we're going to create a gem object called current gem, and we're going to say is equal to, on our board, our all gems array at position X and Y. And then we're going to do a check and say if our current gem that we just set up is not equal to null. So basically we're saying null would happen if there is nothing in that slot. So if there is, basically if there is something in that slot, then we know, hey, we have a gem that we're looking at, so let's start doing some stuff with it. So what we want to do is, first of all, we'll deal with the horizontal axis. So let's go in here. We'll just very quickly do a quick little, I'm very good at drawing these straight lines, as you can see, with a mouse. But let's, so we've got our gems in all these little slots over here, blah, 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 doesn't matter. Let's just imagine these are all gems. So let's say we want to check for a match. Let's say this is our gem that we're looking at right now. When we want to look for a match, we want to look 1 to the right. So we want to see +1 on the x-axis and then -1 on the x-axis. We want to look at both of those gems that we have. But of course we want to make sure that we're not at the edge of the board. So if we're, imagine if we're looking at a gem here, well, this one we can't check that it's to the left, or we can check that it's to the left, but we can't check to the right. So we're going to make sure in here that if our, we want to make sure our x value is greater than 0, so we're not at the very left edge of the board, and we want to make sure that our x value is less than the board.width -1. So much like we did with our gem when we were moving the positions and we made sure that we weren't at the edges, again here we're making sure we're not at the edges of these places. So as long as we're not at those edges, then we're going to say our gem, we're going to create, sorry, a gem called left gem, and that's going to be equal to, on our board in our all gems array at position X -1, and Y is the same. Then we're going to have another gem that we're going to call right gem. So this is the gem to the right, and we're going to set it to be board.all gems at X +1 and Y, like so. And then the first thing we're going to do is make sure that both of those gems are not empty. So if our left gem is not equal to null and our right gem is not equal to null, so as long as those both aren't null, then we need to compare and see if those gems are the same as our gem. But to do that, we obviously need a way to determine what our gems are. So if we go back in here, we can go and let's look at if we play the game here. So we've got all our gems. So we've got a blue gem here. We know as a prefab, the name of it is gem blue. So you might think, hey, just check if they have the same name. But the problem is, first of all, we've replaced the name of that to be gem 4, 5. Secondly, with the gems will be added with a clone tag after their name, sorry, a clone in brackets after their name if we don't change the name. So yes, we could technically check the names and always make sure that they have different names, but you might accidentally name two gems the same if you're doing things in different ways in different projects. And generally speaking, using the name as a comparison is not really a good way to do stuff, because also we're going to want to do some special checks a little bit later for certain types of gems that we want to do different things with. For example, we'll have some stone gems that can't be matched together and can only be broken with bombs that we'll also set up a